Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 32 of the St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, secunda, the second book of the second book. The topic for this lecture is Almsdeeds, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are looking at the exterior acts of charity, right? So we've looked at charity itself, we've looked at the internal acts of charity. Now we're looking at the external acts of charity, and we are now halfway through with almsdeeds. Next we have fraternal correction. So if you want to see a video on any of these other ones, look them up. I have them. Also, if you want to follow along with the Summa, there's a link to this question in the Summa below in the description. Okay, so we have almsdeeds as an act of charity. This has 10 articles to it, so it's a bit longer than the previous acts of charity. So hold on tight, but I think they're pretty interesting questions, so I think it'll go quickly. Is almsdeed, by that we mean giving alms, is giving alms an act of charity? And St. Thomas says, yes it is. Almsdeeds, alms is a deed whereby something is given to the needy out of compassion for God's sake. Right? If you hear that, it sounds an awful lot like mercy, right? Mercy is being compelled to do something for another who is in despair or in distress for the sake of God, because we are able to do so, right? So very similar to charity, very similar to mercy. And St. Thomas points this out. He says, almsgiving is an act of charity through the medium of mercy. So if you are acting in mercy by helping your neighbor, this is almsdeed, but it's an extension of mercy, which is an extension of charity, right? And mercy was a virtue as an extension of charity. So this is all just an extension of charity, right? It's an external act. St. Thomas also points out that the Greek word for almsdeed and charity, misericordiae, right? The Latin and the Greek, they both have the languages have similar root words for both alms and charity. So there's a very literal connection between almsdeeds and charity traditionally. When we look at it, we can look at it both through the lens of formality, right, the form, when we're looking at the four causes, and materiality. This makes it interesting. It's one of the objections and St. Thomas's answers here. Formally, almsdeed is an act of charity. He says formally, right? When, as he defined it above, a deed whereby something is given to the needy out of compassion for God's sake. This is, strictly speaking, pure alms, right? Almsdeed. This is formally almsdeed. Now, what if somebody just is walking down the street and there's a homeless person asking for money and you give him $2 just so he goes away? Is this almsdeed? Not formally, right? Because formally you have to do it out of compassion and for God's sake, right? That would be it, almsdeed formally. But materially, you might have done the same thing, right? So if a person leaves Mass and you're walking down the street and you see a poor person and you give them a few dollars out of love of God and neighbor, and the next person does it just to make the person go away, they did the same material act, right? It's the same $2, right? But one is done out of love and one is done out of selfish means. Strictly speaking, both gave alms materially, but only one gave alms formally, right? So there is a distinction there. The next section is a really great section. Right? It's the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. Question is, are there different kinds of alms, right? So, and here I'm not sure if anyone has laid this out before St. Thomas or not. The corporal works of mercy are clearly taken from Matthew 25:41 or Matthew 25. The separation of the sheep and the goats. You can certainly find Old Testament references to some of the corporal works of mercy. To lay them out in this format like this, the spiritual and corporal works, I'm not sure if it was done before St. Thomas. I don't believe it was. Somebody feel free to fact check me, put it in the comments below. But here he very specifically lays it out. What are the corporal works of mercy? Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, harbor the harborless. Sometimes we would say, give shelter to the homeless, right? To visit the sick, to ransom the captive, and to bury the dead, right? These are the corporal works of mercy. They deal with the body. It's dealing with corporal means body, the bodily things. Now the spiritual works of mercy, St. Thomas says, first what you do, because it's spiritual, is you pray, and then you do what you can, right? So because they're spiritual, to think that it's all you would be a violation of the spiritual principle. So first pray and then do it. So things like instruct the ignorant, counsel the doubtful, comfort the sorrowing, reprove the sinner, forgive injuries, to bear wrongs patiently, and to pray for the living and the dead. Right? Sometimes it's called admonish the sinner too, number 4. Right? These are things that are sometimes dealing with what we would strictly say spiritual, right? Spiritual things like admonish a sinner, right? That is purely a spiritual part. But some of these are just dealing with non-bodily things, right? So things like bearing wrongs patiently, or comforting the sorrow, or instructing the ignorant, right? A math teacher instructs the ignorant too, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be entirely of the spiritual nature, right? Even though they're spiritual works of mercy, we're talking about it's non-bodily, right? Soul, spiritual, psychological even, right? This is, I use this in my class all the time on virtue ethics. I think it's a very important thing for people to commit to memory and to have at the tip of your tongue, because if we want to say, how are we going to be good people, right? If we say, I'm a good person, well, good people do good things, right? It's kind of part of the nature of being good. Means if you are a good person, then you do good things, because action follows being. So if your being is good, then your action should be good, right? That's one follows the other, and vice versa. If you want to be a good person, do good things, and then you'll become a good person, right? It goes both ways. Well, what is doing good things? What does that mean, doing good things? I think a very good place to start for that is the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. If you keep busy doing these 14 things for most of your day, good chance you're doing a lot of good, right? Probably doing good. Now, which is better, the spiritual or the corporeal, right? And this should be fairly obvious what the answer would be, but St. Thomas, of course, looks at it both ways. So on one hand, the spiritual is better than the corporeal in terms of giving alms, right? So the types of alms you're doing, it would be better to admonish the sinner. It would be better to counsel the doubtful. It would be better to instruct the ignorant than it would be to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give drink to the thirsty. Why? Because you can feed the hungry, but tomorrow you will be hungry. But if you have vanished ignorance, you have done something permanent, right? If you admonish the sinner and the person repents, you may have saved the soul for eternity, right? So it's better to save a soul for eternity than it is to feed them for a day, right? And there's some wisdom in that, right? There's some truth in that for sure, right? One is dealing with the body and one is dealing with an eternal soul, right? Which is more important, the body or the eternal soul? The eternal soul. So that's more important when we look at it just simply on its face. But then on the other hand, St. Thomas says circumstantially, sometimes it's more important to have corporeal alms, corporeal acts. And an example of this would be, if somebody's starving to death, it's nice to admonish the sinner, but, it's not going to be put to very good use if they die. So you need to feed them and then worry about some of these other things, right? So, sometimes this is a focus of Salvation Army or something else. Like, we won't feed you unless you listen to scripture or something else. Go to one of our services first. We're not going to feed you unless you do what we tell you to do. It's kind of a questionable thing, right? Circumstantially, if the person is starving, which is why you're feeding them, feed them first, and then do the spiritual, right? In that order, right? If the person's starving. If they're not starving, then don't worry about it, right? Do the spiritual, but if there's a real need, take care of the body first and then go to the spiritual. Okay. The next one is does corporal alms have a spiritual effect, right? So if you feed the hungry, is there a spiritual reality, consequence that goes on, right? Or is it just you feed the body and the body is fed and that's it? We're just dealing with animal nature, right? Or is our good deeds and the corporal works of mercy, are there spiritual effects to it, right? Is this spiritual element to it? And St. Thomas says, well, in three ways we can look at it. So now you've got this hand, and another hand, right? So on one hand, you're just dealing with the substance, right, which is really the material effect. So somebody's hungry, you feed them, they're full, right? That's the substance of the matter, right? Nothing spiritual. They're thirsty, you give them water, they drink, right? Done. On another hand, there is the cause of your giving. So whoever gives a glass of water to one of the least of these in my name gives it to me, right? And they want for nothing, right? They shall want no reward, because you're giving it in his name, right? In his name is the key part of that. If you're doing it out of love of God and love of neighbor, the cause of your giving is charity now, right? This is just like back to Article 1, right? This is, your intentions is charity, so you're giving perfectly from charity. If you only did the first part, then you're giving only materially, right? And it's, materially it's alms, but it's not formally alms. When you're doing it out of charity, the form is alms, right, as well. And lastly, there's the effect, right? So in terms of the effect, if you give to someone in need, it's their duty to pray for you as their benefactor, right? So if you give a good gift to somebody in need, like when God gives us something good, we should say thank you, right? And give a thanksgiving to God for the good that God has given to us. When our parents do something good for us, we honor them because as God has given us life, our parents have given us life, right? Likewise, if I'm starving and somebody gives me food, I should honor them, right? I should pray for them. I should give thanksgiving for them, right? For what they've given to me. So the effect should be a spiritual effect, right? So when you give alms, just the substance does not do it, right? It's nothing spiritual about that. That's just corporal. But your intentionality, right, is charity, which is spiritual, and then your people praying for you, that's then spiritual as well. St. Thomas uses this great line from Sirach: shut up alms in the heart of the poor, and it shall obtain help for thee for all evil, right? Another line would be, alms forgives a multitude of sins. I think that's from Proverbs, right? Alms forgives a multitude of sins, right? This idea of entrust your alms to the poor, and it's an investment for yourself, right? There's a spiritual element to giving. Is there a precept for alms, right? Is there a law for alms? And St. Thomas points out, let us not love in word nor in tongue, but in deed and in truth, right? So in that way, if you only wish your neighbor well, but you don't do anything to help your neighbor, it's of nothing, right? Not just hearers of the words, but doers of the word, right? That's another way of looking at it. St. Thomas also points out in the contra-argument that in Matthew 25, the separation of the sheep and the goats, eternal salvation depends upon the good deeds you have done for your neighbor, right? What were those deeds? Well, the corporal works of mercy, right? That we just saw in Article 2, right? So doing the corporal works of mercy is the means of salvation. Neglecting the corporal works of mercy is the means for damnation, right? So is it a precept? Well, your soul depends on it, right? So I guess that would make it a yes, right? That would be a precept. That's a pretty important one, I guess, if you look at it that way. Now, you might be hearing this and thinking, well, isn't there something about tithing 10%, or isn't there a prescript for giving in that way? And the answer is yes. Yeah. St. Thomas talks about this under justice, though. So when you get ahead to the cardinal virtues of justice, look up tithing, and there's a lot of rules related to tithing and giving, and who you should give it to and how much and what should be your attitude. St. Thomas goes into great depth with this under the topic of tithing, so I won't get into it right here, although it pops up again in the next couple of articles as well because there's some overlap. St. Thomas also points out that the precept is to give, if you are the giver, to give from your surplus. The command isn't really saying to give from your need, right? God isn't commanding you to give from what you need to survive, for you or for your family or anyone you're responsible for. That's not what God is commanding. But if you have surplus, then yes, right? There's a precept to be generous, right? To show liberality, as we would say, right? Now, who should we give to, right? In terms of the giver, we should give if we have surplus. We should give it to those who are in need. That's who we should give it to. It's not just giving stuff away, right? But it's giving it to those who are in need and can put it to good use, right? Those who can use it. St. Ambrose, kind of echoing the spirit of St. John Chrysostom here, says, feed him that dies of hunger. Feed him that dies of hunger. If thou hast not fed him, thou hast slain him. Right? If somebody dies of hunger and you haven't fed them, you have killed them. Right? Putting a little bit of blame back on you. Right? If a priest or bishop were to say this today, they would get a lot of criticism. But St. Ambrose, this is right in the Fathers of the Church. The food you withhold from the poor is stolen. Right? You are a murderer if they die. Another line from Ambrose here is, why are you rich while another is poor, unless it be that you have the merit of a good steward, and that he, the poor person, the reward of patience. Right? So, in terms of the rich and the poor, we have a very adversarial relationship about this in the United States right now. But the patristic approach, St. Ambrose's approach, would be the poor. Why are the rich rich? Not because they're evil, crooked people, but because they are good stewards. They know how to use money well. That's their gift, right? And the poor, they also have a gift, patience, right? The gift of patience, because they go without, if you ever seen what it's like to be poor, it's a lot of waiting around, right? It's a lot of putting up with nonsense. You just don't get what you want, and you can't just get where you want. If you got to take the bus, you got to plan ahead, and it rains, and you got to stand in the rain, and then the bus is late, and then you have to transfer, and right when you have money, you just jump in your car and drive, right? If you want food assistance, you got to wait. If you want medical assistance, you got to wait, right? When you're poor, life is about waiting, right? So they have patience. And when the rich get to serve the poor, they get to encounter Christ. And when the poor get to receive from the rich, it says if a gift from God the Father, right? It's God who gives us life and gives us nourishment. The benefactors give life to the poor, right? There's this, both sides are able to encounter God in the giving and in the receiving. It's a win-win in a Christian perspective, right? And it both has virtue, both in the giving and in the receiving. It says, it is the hungry man's bread that you withhold. It is the naked man's cloak that you have stored away. The shoes of the barefoot you have left to rot. The money of the needy you have buried underground. And so you injure as many as you might help, right? So every person that you could have helped that you did not, you have injured, right? A little bit of Ebenezer Scrooge, of all the greed is added to the chains of his torment, right? The same, right? Every time you could have done something good and you did not, you have injured, right? As Ambrose said in the previous quote, you have become your neighbor's murderer by withholding what they need, right? So this is very serious, right? I don't think you could read this and think, oh, just throw $1 in the collection plate on a Sunday and you're done. Right? A bit more complicated. You have a bit more of a responsibility than that. Should you give alms out of necessity? And these are these good challenging sections, like good question, right? Should you help the poor out of your necessity or only out of your surplus? If you recall, he just really said you're obligated to give out of your surplus, but are you obligated to give out of necessity really? And St. Thomas quotes, he said, the Gospel of Matthew, if you will be perfect, go and sell what you have and give it to the poor, right? Well, this is Jesus, right? This is Jesus is saying. You'll find this in all the Gospels. Go and take what you have and give it to the poor. If you look at this line, he's not saying take your excess, take your surplus, sell it, and give it to the poor. He doesn't say that. He says all that you have, all that is your surplus, and all that is your necessity, give it to the poor. Right? So that, nothing St. Thomas can say can undo the scriptures. Right? St. Thomas is a great scripture scholar. So he will say, though, on one hand, you are not required to give out of necessity of what you require to live. For you and your household, right? Anyone you're responsible for. You're not expected to starve to death. That's not a virtue. It's not necessary. It's not really what Jesus was intending when he said, go take all you have, sell it, give it to the poor, right? He didn't mean starve to death. That wasn't the purpose. That would be perverse, and God is not perverse, and St. Thomas frequently speaks against perversions like that, right? Don't take it out of context, right? Don't. On the other hand, if we talk about necessity, there's necessity and then there's necessity, right? We say, well, I need this to survive. Well, a lot of things we think we need to survive, we don't really need to survive, right? We say, well, I need a car. Well, you don't need a car. It'd be very difficult without a car, right? Most of the things we say we need, we wouldn't die if we didn't have it. It wouldn't be good, right? It would make life harder, but we don't need it. And some people who say they need something, what they just mean is, I need it to maintain my certain standards of living, right? My certain comforts which I have grown accustomed to, right? So this is not necessity outright, but necessity for you, right? There's a difference between necessity to live and necessity for you. And St. Thomas is kind of balanced on this, to be honest. He's, I guess there's a little bit of Benedictinness that's still in him too. If you read the Rule of St. Benedict, you say, St. Benedict says, some monks require more than other monks, and if you're a monk that requires more, take it graciously, right? Take what you need, take it graciously. If you don't need as much as a monk, don't take as much, and don't be spiteful against those who need more. There's nothing to be envious of. They're weaker people. So what? We live with weaker people. Not everyone can be so hard on themselves, right? If they need a little bit more comfort in order to maintain life as a monk, give them a little bit of comfort. Who cares, right? You worry about yourself, right? That's the most important thing. And don't grumble against your brother and sister. Something similar in this. And St. Thomas, he was going to be the abbot of Monte Cassino monastery, Benedictine, before he became a Dominican. So I think he was influenced by this a little bit. But his approach is, you're not required to... You should make yourself a little bit uncomfortable, right? You should push yourself. But you should not do it in such a way that it destroys your status in life and becomes unsustainable, right? Let's say you're fairly well off and you've gotten rid of everything, and now you're just miserable and you're grumpy and you're resentful. What was the point, right? If it wasn't done out of love, what was the point, right? If you didn't give it out of joy, what was the point, right? So push yourself, but it's not to destroy one's status in life. We're not all supposed to be beggars, right? It's not the point. And he also points out, some people, they've come from different backgrounds, and I think there's some practicality in this. If let's say somebody was a lady, right? Lords and ladies and dukes, and from that, and her husband dies and had spent all the money, and here's a woman of noble birth and high standards of living, and she's lost everything, for another rich family to take her and let her stay with them. You could say, well, that's not fair. There's other poor people. Why are you taking care of this woman, right? She had privilege her whole life. Well, she's a woman of higher means, a higher status of life. For her to live as a beggar would just crush her soul, right? There's this... St. Thomas has some level of compassion for people who've lived a certain status of life and have lived a certain way, and because ultimately people who are in those positions, they are supposed to have excelled in virtue in certain ways, but to be patient. I think St. Thomas here is quite very human in this, right? It's not an idealistic thing, right? Kant or utilitarians, they treat everyone equally, impartially, right? Rationally. St. Thomas, he's more have a heart, right? Have a heart. You know, her husband was an alcoholic. It wasn't her fault, right? It's not her fault. Why should we embarrass her? Why, drag her through the mud after everything she's been through? I don't know. St. Thomas, though, says there are 3 exceptions to this, where, okay, don't be reasonable, right? There's 3 times when you can throw caution to the wind, and one is in terms of vows of religion. So St. Thomas says, give, but you give like it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? You give because you're going to give over your entire life, right? For your whole life you're going to give, so just don't dump it all, throw all the money out. The exception would be religious vows, right? If you're religious, you renounce all of your possessions and you take vows, right? And that way, yeah, you've renounced all of it, and you've renounced it all at once, right? Like St. Francis, who strips down and kneels down before the bishop, vowing poverty, right? That's a vow of religion. If it's easily recovered, right? I can't even think of an example of this, but give recklessly if you can easily recover it and it's not that big of a deal. I guess if you're a very rich person, you can give large amounts of money and you're going to make it back, right? Elon Musk gives away $1 billion. It's hardly anything to him, right? The next would be if it's to provide for a great need, right? If it's a tremendous need, then you give recklessly, right? Charles Borromeo was a good example of this as Archbishop of Milan. The Archbishop of Milan's residence prior to the Counter-Reformation, right? Why was there a Reformation? It was usually in response to a lot of the exorbitant wealth of the church, right? Especially archbishops of prominent dioceses like Milan. So the bishop's, cardinal's residency would have been fairly extravagant. So he's a Counter-Reformation cardinal, and there's a plague that hits, and he takes all the furnishings off the wall and he turns them into clothes for plague victims, and he empties out the cardinal's palace in order to feed everyone and to help the town survive during a plague, right? So he's emptied the cardinal's residence. Well, if he just did this because, well, it's good to give alms, that would be reckless. It would be a reckless thing to do, right? He could gradually, simplify it. That would be rational, reasonable. But to empty it out like that, why would you empty it? Well, because of the great need. The people in his city were starving to death, right? Because it was a plague. They couldn't get food. They needed money. Nobody could work. You couldn't trade. And he sold everything to provide for his people. Well, that makes sense, right? And then be completely reckless in giving alms. Number 7, how about ill-gotten gains? Can you give alms out of ill-gotten gains? Now this is where, if you jump ahead to justice, this differs. So in terms of justice, can you give ill-gotten gains as oblations, first fruits, sacrifice, tithes? This is gifts given over to the church just to pay for the liturgies of the church, to pay for the priesthood, and to pay for the poor. Right? These are the 3 reasons why we've tithed, to sustain the church functions, to sustain the clergy, and to sustain the poor. So can you have ill-gotten gains and you spend it on these things? And the answer in general is no, because you don't want stolen money or drug money, pirated money, or ill-gotten gains to be used to buy the bread for the sacrifice of the Mass, right? To buy the vestments for the liturgy, to buy the incense for the liturgy, to pay for the priests, to pay for the poor. This would be a sacrilege and a scandal, right? To use something that was derived from sin in order for the worship of God. Right? This would be sin. Now, if somebody just put money in the collection basket and nobody knows where it came from, or you got a donation and you didn't know, well, that's a different story, right? Because if you don't know, you're not in. The church is not required to do an investigation every time somebody puts $20 in the collection basket, right? Imagining the show Breaking Bad and the Pollos Hermanos. It seems like a very upstanding chicken restaurant, and it turns out the guy running it is a major drug mover, right? If you know he's a drug mover, then you don't take the money. But if it's a chicken restaurant, then I guess you can, right? So it depends on what you know, and when it comes to justice, right? In terms of justice. Now, in terms of alms, this is different, right? This is different because this is really giving right to the poor, right? It's not going through the church necessarily as an intermediary. You could, right? You could give it to the church, you could give it to the state, but this isn't a religious obligation to give it to the church or anything, right? Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the imprisoned, welcome the stranger, and things like that. We're not talking about to the church, we're talking direct aid. This is different. This can be different. Some things are the same, but some are different. So in 3 ways we can look at these ill-gotten gains in terms of almsgiving. In terms of rapine, which is stealing through violence. What would we call that today? Armed robbery, right? I don't know. Violent theft, right? Like robbery. Robbery is violent theft, so that's what we mean with rapine. Or usury, right? Taking high interest on a loan, something like that. If you have taken money through these means, right? Theft, robbery, usury, stolen property, embezzlement, things like that. Should you use it to give alms to the poor? And the answer would be no, because it's not really yours. What should you do with that money? Give it back. Give it back to who it belongs to. If you stole it from someone, return it to the person you stole from. If you embezzled it, return it. If you had committed usury, return it to the people you abused through usury, right? This isn't your money, so give it back, right? That's the proper response to illegal gains. Now, what if it's illegal giving and receiving? What would be an example of this? Well, how about if the person were a drug dealer? So somebody bought drugs, you gave them drugs, and now the money you have from drug dealing, can you give alms with it? Well, it's different than the first set, because you can't say, well, the proper thing to do would be give the money back to the people who bought the drugs. Well, they were doing something bad too, buying drugs, right? So, and if you give them the money back, what would they do? Probably buy more drugs, right? So this isn't going to work. Or you sell guns illegally, right? You're not going to give the money back to the person who bought the gun. Oh, you got the gun, and here's your money back too. You got a free gun. Well, if the whole point was that it was illegal to begin with, then giving money back when both parties are guilty doesn't make any sense. So what should you do with the money then, right? What should you do with the money? Give it to the poor, right? That's a good fit for it, right? If you think of Judas, right? Judas betrays Christ for 30 pieces of silver, and he says, so I don't want it after all. And they said, you took it, you're stuck with it. And he hangs himself. Well, what does what is anybody else going to? Nobody else wants that money either. That's blood money, right? They used it to betray his best friend, right? Blood money. What did they do with it? They used it to buy land for a cemetery for the poor and people who have no place to be buried, right? So they used it for something else, right? But nobody wanted to touch it, right? I don't want the money, right? So that would be alms, right? Buying land for a cemetery for the poor would be alms, because the money's dirty, right? It's dirty money. Now, how about what if it's legal but immoral? And St. Thomas's example is about prostitution. At the time he's writing, it's legal. I guess some places it's still legal, but it's not legal everywhere. Well, let's say it's prostitution or whoring. There's a lot of whores in this section in terms of his writing. It's kind of brutal towards it. But he's saying, if you were a prostitute and you have this money, you gained it legally, but immorally. What can you do with that money? Well, you can give it as alms, because what are you going to do? Give it, if you're a woman who's a prostitute, you're going to give it back to the man who paid you for sex? Well, you can't undo the act. Giving him the money back isn't a solution, right? And it's legally yours, right? It's legally yours. If you want to use it to help the poor, you can do that, right? Now, in this case, you could not accept this money for oblations for religious ritual, right? For the church, because it's from sin, so you wouldn't want it. But you could in this case for the poor, right? In some ways, it's taking something that's negative and it's turning it into something slightly positive, right? Assuming a drug dealer would give the money they made to the poor, it's a sign of some type of repentance, if anything, right? So, now, who can give alms? Well, basically anyone can give alms, but there's some exceptions or some limitations, mostly in terms of servants, right? Servants. Maybe this is more relevant than I initially thought. Like how many people work at restaurants and they give somebody some free French fries or free soda or free drinks at the bar or something like this, and they act so generous and they might get a bigger tip for being so generous, but really they're giving away the owner of the place's alcohol or food or whatever it is. They're giving away somebody else's stuff, right? Sometimes so that people like them and give them a bigger tip. Just sometimes maybe they think they're being generous, but they're being generous with somebody else's belongings, right? This is not allowed, right? So if you are a servant, you should not be giving alms with your owners or your masters or your bosses' possessions, right? They're not yours to give. If you could ask them if they want to give it, you could. If they ask you to give it, you can give it, but you don't do it. You don't give it yourself, right? The other example St. Thomas has given is monks, for example, right? Again, his Benedictine side is shining through, or his Dominican side is shining through. If you are a monk, you don't own anything. Everything belongs to the community. The only person who can choose to give anything away is the abbot. So if you're a monk who's giving away the monastery's possessions, even if it's well-intentioned, that should not be done because you don't have the right to do that. That's the nature of your vows, right? Another would be wives. This was an interesting section. It'd be worth reading it if anyone's... I think it's a very well written and interesting, right? Not exactly what we would think of today, but I think well written in a classical way. And his point is, this is a time that the men are at work and women are watching the home. But you can see within his philosophy, the purpose of one of the duties of the wife is to oversee and administer the resources of the household. That's something the husband brings in the resources, but the wife knows how to operate the goods of the household. She has to determine how to use the food that comes in. She has to know what to spend the money on, what not to spend the money on. She's responsible for taking care of the clothing and the material possessions of the house. She's responsible for overseeing and taking care of all that stuff. She's the steward of the house. And because she's the steward of the house, she's also probably primarily responsible for helping the poor with their resources. She knows what they can afford to help the poor with, right? And if it means like tightening up a little bit in order to do something good for someone, she knows how to tighten it up, right? It's really the job of the husband just to bring in the money and to hand it over to her, and she knows how to do the finances. So she can use her discretion to spend the money of the family to help the poor with almsgiving. But he does point out that she should do it moderately, not too much. Just be careful, right? Don't give away everything, right? Be rational, be moderate with it. In addition, she should let her husband know and be in full communication with him about what they're giving away, and he should agree to what she's decided to do with the money in terms of helping the poor. So in some ways it's kind of a beautiful approach, right? It's really looking at both people being a team in that relationship. At the same time, it still kind of maintains some of the stereotypes of women being stewards of the household and men being the breadwinners of the household, but I think it's kind of beautiful. In terms of the children, children can also give alms, but again, they are under their parents, principally the father, but under their parents, and anything the child has really belongs to the parents, technically and legally. So they shouldn't be wild with giving away something that doesn't belong to them, but they can give small amounts, and that's a good and holy thing to do. Who should get the alms? This is another interesting one. St. Thomas uses these two quotes, which I think are very helpful. One is, "If any man have not care of his own, and especially for those of his house, he hath denied faith and is worse than an infidel." Now, St. Thomas uses this again, has just used this very recently again, coming from Timothy. If you don't take care of your own house, then you're really awful, right? So who should get the alms? You got to take care of your family first, right? That's the general principle. If you're not able to take care of your family, you're not worth anything. So first, take care of your family. And this is the inside-out approach, right? It's heat warms things up from the center, right? A hot thing radiates out heat. Money radiates out. Mercy radiates out, right? We see this a lot in charity, right? Charity starts at home, right? Giving starts locally, and it extends out. Quoting St. Augustine, "It falls to us by lot, as it were, to have a look to the welfare of those who are most closely united to us." Right? This is another great line from St. Augustine. Right? I don't know people in rural India. I don't know people in Australia. I don't know people in South Africa. So to say, well, I'm going to spend all my energy on helping people in South Africa. I don't know anyone in South Africa. I have been placed here at this time, at this place, in the midst of a particular community and a particular family. If I take care of the circle around me, there's somebody who is in South Africa who can do that to the circle around them in South Africa, and there's somebody in India who can do that for the circle around them in India, I shouldn't step over the people who are directly in front of me to help somebody on the other side of the planet. That doesn't make any sense, right? This is Timothy, this is St. Augustine, right? However, there are exceptions to this, right? And it's due to circumstances. Again, point out the war in Ukraine, right? People are sending socks and clothes and diapers and medical supplies to be shipped to Poland to help refugees from Ukraine because there's a war, right? Typically, we wouldn't be sending socks to Poland, but because of a war, we are, right? So because of the circumstances, we can sometimes say, well, they have such a great need that we should respond. You know, an earthquake in Haiti, right? Tremendous need, we should respond, even if you don't know anyone in Haiti, you should respond if you can, right? Because of the tremendous need. And there's some things that are just perpetual and going on around the world, right? Haiti is always needing help, right? Nigeria is always needing help, right? Until they're not. But in the meantime, as long as I've lived, they've needed help, right? So could we go above and beyond to try to do something to help them, knowing that they are a community in tremendous amounts of need? Yeah, to say, well, my friend needs to have the newest iPhone, but these kids can't even go to school and they don't even have food, right? What's the priority? Well, the kids that don't even have food to eat are more of a priority over my friend having the newest iPhone, right? Or me having the newest iPhone. So circumstances can override the natural, right? If we go back to mercy, this was all, the natural thing is to be good to your friends, and grace builds on nature, and this nature that we have is part of the divine plan, right? The divine law. So it's okay for us to be good to our friends because that's natural, right? But sometimes we go beyond what's natural because of the tremendous need. And our final article, how should we give alms? And this is a nice short one, thankfully, from the book of Tobit. If thou have much, give abundantly, right? If you have, give, right? How should we give? Abundantly. That's how we should give. It says the giver. It is good advice to give abundantly, to give more than we think we can, right? It's the image of the widow giving the denarii, right? The widow's mite. Give as, if you're poor and you give, and you're rich and you give, the important thing is that you push yourself to give, right? To help those who are less fortunate than you. Why? Because of charity. Why do we give out of charity? For love of God, right? If you love God, you help your neighbor. Right? This is charity. That's why we do it. Now, on the other side, the receiver. This is taken in two ways. On one hand, the receiver should get, they should get what they need, right? If you're starving, you should get food, right? If you're thirsty, you should get drink. If you're homeless, you should get shelter, right? If you're in prison, you should get visitors, right? But all of these corporal works of mercy, if you're in need, you should have your needs met, right? How much? Not abundantly, right? Minimally, right? If you are hungry, you should be fed. Not lobster, not caviar, food, right? Good, nutritious food. Right? That's what you should receive. You need money, how much, right? A reasonable amount. Now, this is, again, sometimes criticisms within our own culture, within our own society. I know parish work that I had been doing. I had a group home not far from where my parish was, and people who had a phone would come in and they would have a second phone because Obama gave out an Obama phone. So now they have two cell phones that they weren't paying for either one of them. They have two free cell phones. How these people are the poor? Why do the poor have two cell phones for free? I didn't get any. I don't have one cell phone. I have this junky broken cell phone, and they have two cell phones, two new cell phones. This doesn't seem to make any sense. Or during the pandemic, where people who were going to work were working, and they might have had reduced hours or whatever it was. And if you stopped working, you got an extra $600 a week in addition to your unemployment benefit. So you could be making $900 a week or something like that. In the meantime, your colleague who's still at work is making $900 a month, and you're making $900 a week, right? How much should we give? Not abundantly, right? We should give abundantly of ourselves, but as in terms of being a receiver, you should get what you need, right? You should get what you need and not receive abundantly. That might be controversial for some people, but I think that's a very balanced approach, right? And point this out, what's the point of not receiving abundantly? Isn't it better to receive abundantly? Well, the point is, St. Thomas points out, is that if you just give people what they need, you're able to help more people, right? Let's say the person needs $100. Let's say a person needs $100 to get by, but you've given them $400. They only need $100. What is the price of giving them $400? The price is 3 other people who are not going to have anything, right? 3 other people are going to get 0, when you could have helped 4 people with $100, right? So you could have helped many versus helping 1, right? It's being a good steward of your giving, right? So giving to people according to their need is important, right? And trying to do as much good as you can with the alms that you give, right? Give it to where it's going to be useful, right? This is some of Peter Singer, a utilitarian, his criticism of a lot of our charities. We do a lot of charities that we call them charities, but they are very feel-good things when some things could really make more of a difference, like the Make-A-Wish Foundation, spending $10,000 to have Batman show up to a sick child's house and take them to Six Flags when the kid can't even go on any of the rides. It's $10,000 spent on one sick kid going to an amusement park. Worth it? Or what if you use those $10,000 to buy malaria vaccines for children in Africa, or mosquito nets? You could have perhaps saved thousands of lives, or made a tremendous difference in a number of people's lives versus making a minor difference in one person's life, right? This is good stewardship. So in conclusion, almsgiving is an act of charity through mercy. There are both the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, which are types of alms. Which is greater? Typically, spiritual works of mercy are, but sometimes corporal works of mercy are more important depending on the need, right? Somebody starving to death in that moment, the corporal works of mercy are more important. Is there a spiritual effect to the giving? If it's done in charity, yes. Right? If it's just done materially, no. Right? There is a spiritual effect, typically, though. Is it a matter of precept? Kinda. Right? Not in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, certainly. Yeah. The separation of the sheep and goats sets a pretty strong standard of what's expected of us, and meeting the corporal works of mercy are rather important to Jesus. Should we give from our need? Sometimes, yeah, if we can, but more specifically, we must give from our surplus. Should we give from our ill-gotten gains? Not if it doesn't belong to us, right? If it's stolen, then no, right? If it's just, we've repented and we've gotten it through bad ways or unethical ways, then yes, give it to the poor, right? Let the money do something good. Who can give? Well, anyone can really give, but you should only give your own stuff away and not somebody else's stuff. That's important. Who should get it? Those who need it the most, right? And only to the degree that it can still be useful to them. And it's better to help many than it is to help one. And how should alms be given? Abundantly. And how should they be received? Sparingly. So that more people can benefit from it. So that is it. And next we move on to fraternal correction. So sorry for this one being so long, but it was a very good one.